Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. Jim Brett here at the New England Council. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. It is hard to believe that we are officially halfway through 2021. Yet we still have a few more great programs planned in the next couple of weeks. And we really hope to resume some in-person program later in the year that so many of you have asked us, when are we going to have them? And hopefully sooner rather than later, but stay tuned. To complement this investing in an infrastructure series, on July 14th, we're looking forward to a very, very special edition of the Capitol Hill Report with Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Many of you know the Senator has been deeply involved with the ongoing work in Washington to reach a bipartisan infrastructure deal. And she'll be providing the New England Council members with an update on all her good efforts. So stay tuned for that. I think this is going to be a really well-attended forum. The following day, we are hosting a presentation on an incredible online platform called InternX, which helps connect employers with student interns from underrepresented communities. If your organization is looking for interns and looking to foster more diversity within your workforce, this is a great opportunity to learn more about this wonderful tool. Now, following that, on July 22nd, we're going to wrap up our Investing in Infrastructure series with our fourth and final program. And we're going to be looking at the need to invest in 5G and broadband infrastructure to support the innovation that is needed here in our region. So we've already hosted discussions exploring transportation and energy infrastructure challenges. And this morning, we're excited to present the third installment of this series. Our panel today will tackle perhaps one of the most complicated questions. How do we pay for much needed infrastructure upgrades? This conversation is especially timely since just last week, the White House and congressional leaders announced that they've reached a $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure deal, which includes a variety of approaches to funding investments. To lead today's discussion, fortunate to welcome Peter Palumbo. He's the CEO of EPB, formerly known as the Economic Development Research Group. EBP provides clients with economic expertise and analysis to guide policies, programs, and investments in the transportation, energy, environment, economic development sectors. Peter is a national expert in multimodal transportation policy and planning, regional economic development, organizational development, and strategic management. He's co-authored numerous research reports and guidebooks on transportation planning, policy analysis, goods movement, and a sought-after speaker on transportation planning topics. The full bios of our panelists were included in the reminder email that we sent yesterday, but let me quickly introduce them. Christian Feld is the Vice President, ML Strategies. Prior to joining ML, he held a variety of staff leadership roles with the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. Early in his career, he held several different staff positions in the House. Mary McGuire is the Director of Public and Government Affairs at AAA Northeast, where she is the organization's media spokesperson and advocate for policies that improve traffic safety and transportation. She joined AAA after a very successful career in broadcast journalism here in New England. John Pollock is a Managing Director and Head of Infrastructure at AIG. In that role, he's responsible for managing debt investment in utilities, energy, and single asset, standalone projects financing. A portfolio that includes over 200 investments in 16 countries. Needless to say, we are grateful to all four of these experts for taking the time to join us for today's discussion. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Peter to kick off the discussion.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and excited to have the opportunity to be part of this discussion, which, as Jim said, I think is very timely and extremely important. You know, we're at a place, I believe, in the world of infrastructure investment in this country where we're really recognizing at all levels the needs to rethink, re-engineer, perhaps in a very fundamental way, how we pay for infrastructure needs and what we define as essential infrastructure as well. And again, how that informs the way we pay for that. And certainly the heat wave that parts of the country are in right now, for example, are drawing attention to issues as diverse but interconnected as climate change and resiliency, the use of petroleum-based transportation, access to healthcare, telecommuting and remote work options and so forth. And all of these things obviously are very interconnected, a very complex system of activities and parts of our infrastructure. So again, I think this is a very timely discussion, and I'm really happy we have three such insightful and informed people to talk to us today. So there is you have the ability, I believe, to submit questions as we go along, and we will start responding to those after our three panelists have had their initial comments here this morning. So with that, let's start off talking about one of the perhaps most sort of visible and fundamental issues out there, highway funding and finance. We all know most of us know, I think, the Highway Trust Fund, the Federal Highway Trust Fund, relies mainly on gas tax revenues to fund itself and put that money back out to states to invest in and support highway maintenance, operation, expansion, and so forth. But the federal gas tax hasn't been raised in more than 20 years. And so it's stagnating, and the gap is becoming more and more every year. And of course, the emergence and steady transition to hybrid and all electric vehicles is really only exacerbating this situation. So I'd like to start off with Mary giving us her perspective and thoughts and insights on this gas tax and alternatives to the gas tax issue. Mary?
Sure. Good morning, Peter and Jim. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. So to put this in perspective, the last time the federal gasoline tax was raised was October 1993, when the average price at the pump was $1.11 a gallon. So the good old days. Yet over these 28 years, with no increase in the federal gas tax, the price of building and maintaining roads and bridges has shot up at the same time, leaving the Highway Trust Fund, as you said, Peter, running on fumes, essentially, projected to run out of money by the end of this year. There have been several proposals to raise the federal gas tax over the years since 1993, but none has been seriously considered since that last increase, which, by the way, raised the federal tax from 14.1 cents to 18.4 cents. In fact, it's estimated that the purchasing power of the gas tax has really shrunk. It's been reduced by 2/3 roughly over the years, with vehicles using less gas as they become more fuel efficient, and the cost of labor and building materials, concrete, asphalt, and machinery soaring exponentially at the same time. So we really lose gas tax revenue every day just because of inflation. Experts say if we had indexed the gas tax to inflation in 1993, fuel tax revenues would be double what they are now. The federal gas tax now brings in roughly $34 billion a year, but federal spending typically tops $50 billion annually. And last year, due to the pandemic, highway trust fund receipts were down, of course, more than 9% over 2019 due to less driving, which we were all doing, many of us working from home. In addition, electric vehicles account for less than 2% of the market share now, with roughly half of all sales in California. But EVs are gaining in popularity, and a number of automakers are eyeing all electric fleets by 2035. General Motors, for example, has announced it will sell only zero-emission vehicles by 2035, a real seismic shift for one of the world's largest automakers. Despite all this, the reluctance to raise the federal gas tax continues right up to the present. President Biden has decreed there will be no hike in the federal tax due to the fact that he has pledged not to raise taxes on Americans making less than $400,000 a year. And he says the proposed gas tax, as well as the vehicle miles traveled tax, would do exactly that, of course. So that is a non-starter for Biden. President Trump also told congressional leaders he'd be open to a 25-cent per gallon increase to help pay for his proposed infrastructure plan at the time. But the proposal was dead on arrival in Congress, where, as we know, many lawmakers had taken pledges never to raise any taxes. So because the Congress won't act, since 2010, 33 states have raised their own motor fuel taxes. And so far this year, roughly half the states have introduced bills related to gas taxes. A number of states are also indexing gas taxes to inflation. Not so here in Massachusetts, though, where voters successfully repealed the law indexing the gas tax to inflation at the ballot in 2014. A continuing theme in the debate has been that voters are concerned that funds designed to drive transportation will be diverted to other spending priorities. So equity, transparency, and accountability need to be front and center in all discussions regarding the gas tax, VMT, and transportation in general. And policymakers really need to clearly demonstrate to voters that there is a clear cause and effect. So in other words, increased taxes will pave the way for transportation improvements that will be meaningful to all of us, that will make us safer, decrease congestion, and improve efficiency across all modes of transportation.
Great, thank you, Mary. Just wondering if John or Christian, do you have some thoughts to kind of build on what Mary said related to the gas tax issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Mary, that's you know, the purchasing power of the gas tax is interesting, not only because it hasn't gone up, but also the expense of road construction. The National Highway has an index that roughly has exceeded CPI 2 times since 1993. So if you think about how the cost of a ton of cement, the cost of labor for building roads, it's not increasing in lockstep with CPI. It's about it's on average 2.9% since 1993. So your dollar of gas tax is worth less in terms of miles of road to travel too. Just wanted to reiterate, there's another compounding thing too.
Christian, thoughts on that?
I would only note, and perhaps I'm being Captain Obvious here, but when the gas tax was raised in 1993, the election of 1994 promptly kicked out Democrats out of control of the House and the Senate, and they had been in control of the House for quite some time and actually had taken the majority for granted. So if there's any political jitteriness about raising the federal gas tax, I think it's part of it is from the lessons that have been learned from 1993. I mean, having said that, you know, I am not an expert on this like the other panelists, but it is interesting to see that businesses, though, are increasingly being vocal about the need to raise the gas tax. And it's not only for infrastructure purposes, but even prominent Republicans have talked about a carbon tax, for instance, in order to mitigate against climate change. And obviously a gasoline tax is a sort of type of carbon tax. But again, because of how unpopular raising the gas tax has proven, at least in the past, the political headwinds in Congress, I think, are just not there, because it's too easy Even though I think a lot of very serious public policy thinkers think this is a no-brainer for various reasons, politically it just remains so unpopular. Again, probably stating the obvious, but I just throw that in there.
Well, just building on that, and if you're Captain Obvious, I guess maybe I'm Commander Obvious with this comment, or so does that mean that, you know, it's just going to remain in the hands of the states to address this for the foreseeable future?
I think that would have to be the case unless there's actually some sort of bipartisan agreement to do something on this. So for instance, and I don't want to necessarily, you know, stereotype my Republican friends on the other side of the aisle, but if business interests were to weigh in more heavily, maybe with Republican members and say, hey, look, this really is a pro-business, pro-American economy measure that we could take, cut a deal with the Democrats on this, I think then maybe you might see something at the federal level. But taxes remain very ideologically partisan, and so until that partisan divide is sort of bridged, it probably will remain at the state level.
Sure. Mary, any additional thoughts on this before we move on to our next topic?
Well, you know, certainly we've seen the states act, you know, in many cases. You know, again, Massachusetts hiked its state gas tax 3 cents in 2013, the first increase since 1991. A current Mass Senate bill proposes a 12-cent increase. We just saw the Connecticut General Assembly pass a heavy usage fee for large trucks, which is expected to bring in about $90 million annually for infrastructure, and Governor Lamont is expected to sign the bill as early as this week. We saw New Jersey boost its gas tax by 23 cents in 2016, and the tax in New Jersey just rose again by 9 cents last October as part of a formula that was established under Governor Christie. And that money goes to mass transit and bridge repair primarily. And, you know, I think the list goes on. Since 2013, more than 30 states have enacted legislation to increase their state gas taxes. So, you know, in all different types of structures. Some are fixed cent per gallon rates. 22 states have a variable rate gas tax that adjusts to some degree with inflation. And there are a variety of different formulas based on gasoline prices at the pump, et cetera. So, you know, certainly to your point and to your comments, I think we're seeing the states absolutely move to act to make up for shortfalls. They simply have to if they're going to shore up their infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me, before we leave this topic, actually, you just piqued a thought in my head. You know, my firm, we work quite a bit in the world of VMT fees and what are known as road user charges, or RUCs. You know, again, where is, you think, the appetite or you know, willingness to really embrace some of these alternatives to the gas tax? I mean, recognizing that politically, I guess anything that raises revenue is going to be labeled a tax of some sort, regardless of its intent or benefits. Anyone thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm a Democrat, so what I say, I'm trying my best not to sound partisan on this, but as long as so much of our public debate is over taxes and where you have a sizable chunk of the Republican Party just where they have pledged no new taxes at all, I just don't see how even creative alternatives to the gasoline tax get raised. It's just such a politically explosive issue. And, you know, particularly when you have the margins in both the Senate and the House are so razor thin, and I think it's going to remain that way. It's just a very it's too easy to demagogue, maybe is a bad word, but it's too easy to exploit. Both sides can use it for political purposes that I think that it's just very difficult to try and find something that is politically workable.
Let me ask a question. Is user fee palatable?
It not if it's just called a tax. I mean, you know, it's just a matter of how you characterize it, and user fees would be, and as it has in the past, it's been characterized as a tax.
You know, so Oregon was really the pioneer here, as I think we all know, starting its pilot on VMT in 2015. And Oregon has said, lawmakers are now saying, let's go ahead and put this to a vote. It's been operating with 5,000 volunteers since 2015. Other states have picked up the gauntlet. Utah, California, Nevada, Washington State, Virginia, Pennsylvania all have pilots going as well. So certainly there's some exploration of VMT out there. But it will be interesting to see if Oregon does act to create some kind of permanent model this session. I think there have been privacy concerns in Oregon, as there are generally with VMT, because of the fact that most of the volunteers use their cell phones to record mileage in Oregon. So critics say that it's giving government a window into people's lives. So that's clearly one of the big concerns when it comes to VMT, along with equity and accountability and those issues as well. So, we're seeing some controversy in California, for example, where the concern is that those who can't afford to live near where they work, because California housing prices are the highest in the nation, have to drive long distances, meaning they would have to pay more VMT tax than those who can afford more expensive homes near city centers. So it's been determined that California commuters who are driving longer distances are largely blue collar workers, and those earning minimum wage would be most impacted by a VMT. So many Californians already have difficulty filling their tanks due to the highest gasoline prices for the most part in the nation, and a high gas tax, and VMT would impose an additional burden. So again, there are many concerns, very legitimate concerns about equity in terms of VMT, being a potential replacement for the gas tax in terms of long-term sustainability.
Yeah. And
all of these initiatives that Mary points out at the state level, this is not unique to just gasoline taxes and transportation. I mean, this is unique across a whole spectrum of issues, whether it's minimum wage, whether it's privacy, you name it. I mean, state, because of Congress's inability in general to pass meaningful legislation on various topics, the states have been taking the lead on a lot of this stuff. So again, maybe a little bit Captain Obvious, but yes, the states have been leading the way on a lot of things.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's move on to our second broad topic here. And John, I'm gonna ask you to kind of kick us off here. When we think about or talk about infrastructure writ large, what kinds of facilities, projects, initiatives really should be considered when we talk about infrastructure funding and finance? I think, a lot of people think infrastructure and they generally kind of automatically default to transportation. But, things like climate resiliency and ESG issues, I think are part of this discussion as well, at least in many people's minds. So, how broadly do you think infrastructure should be defined when we talk about public funding and finance?
This is a 12-part answer. I'll be taking, the first hour and a half, and then
Great.
you'll subsequently. I mean, that is the biggest question of all. Infrastructure was once told me by a professor of infrastructure that has as many definitions as there are people who are working in the field. Transportation is obvious to the captain, and but there are, even within transportation, there's a whole bunch of different models that bring in public dollars and use private dollars differently. And so, I have to look at it through the lens of where I sit. It really is split into two things. One is investable infrastructure, and then everything else. So that's not exclusively split between public and private, because there, as the United States has a very large public finance market, and investable infrastructure can include projects done at the municipal level that may or may not be tax exempt, and in a sense that the payment for them is out of a general obligation bond or a general use kind of project. But beyond infrastructure, I think large components of utilities are are also should be considered infrastructure. The transmission lines and pipelines are constructed with general rights and uses of right of way that are granted by government entities. Eminent domain was, we think of when people ran highways, but that also takes place with pipelines and transmission. So there's a big chunk of the utility space and energy space that is also invest.
Oh no, he's leaving us hanging. Let's see. John, if you can hear us.
He's back, I think.
John, you were frozen for about 30 seconds.
Oh, sorry. I wasn't frozen. I'm being told I was unstable, which is probably true on lots of points. So I don't know if I mentioned, but education is another component of public infrastructure that is unique to the United States. In that we have a real model for public education systems, which I think are integral to infrastructure. So back to my point of what I was thinking, investable infrastructure from the seat that I have at AIG is putting money to work, investing in long-term assets. If you think back to, if you can sort of split it up into things that people have an expectation to pay for. In that I get a water bill, I get a utility bill, I don't get a police bill. I don't get a fire bill. I don't get my piece of the criminal justice system. So, for example, would we do a deal for private jails? Kind of tough. Jails and courthouse facilities have historically been financed at a public level. There are private companies that do it. There's a project in Long Beach, California for a criminal justice facility. The likelihood of private investors foreclosing on those kinds of assets is remote. So they represent a different view, a different possibility, but I think that they're probably going to continue to be better served from the public perspective, from a public finance perspective, rather than an individual user perspective. So if I could broadly split, the original Biden proposal had split infrastructure into three big pieces. One is what I would call traditional infrastructure, and that's fixing existing roadways. That is expanding existing networks, and that it was basically maintaining what we have in the same sort of fashion. And that was roughly a third of the dollars. The second third, or the middle chunk, was what I would consider innovative infrastructure, and that was recharging stations. That was to enable an electrification on the roads. It was transit expansion, high-speed rail. United States, the fastest train that goes, I think, is 88 miles an hour when they're going 200 plus miles an hour elsewhere. Community energy programs, the co-op, basically co-op kinds of facilities. So the second piece was what I would just call innovative infrastructure, and next generation. And that may be that may be opposed to the traditional, the traditional infrastructure, in the sense of, let's add a couple of lanes to a highway. That's going to cost X million dollars. Well, if we took that X million dollars and put it somewhere in autonomous vehicles, or recharging, or different kinds of infrastructure, of transportation infrastructure, it's not the same thing. It's a situation where they may, $1 in the for an expansion of a highway, of an interstate highway is $1 that maybe should have been spent in building a toll road or building a different on-ramp someplace. And then the third piece of the Biden proposal was, I'm grappling with whether it was public infrastructure or more social infrastructure, and that was the intent was education. The intent was righting wrongs that had been, highways had gone through disadvantaged communities and that sort of thing. And roughly the dollars were split a third in the Biden proposal. The new proposals that have come out recognize the importance of the traditional infrastructure and pay and focus on that, as well as components of the second. And I think that the third piece is going to have to come from outside of a, while it may be considered infrastructure by some viewers, I think it's outside of outside of the mandate that is feasible. But that being said, there represents a tremendous opportunity. The United States, I'll just focus on electric generation. There's enough wind in the Dakotas to power the United States 24/7. There's enough geothermal energy in Idaho to power the United States 24/7. And in 4 counties in Arizona, there's enough solar to power the United States 24/7. If we had batteries, if we had transmission, or not necessarily batteries, but energy storage, if we had transmission, if we had load shedding and cost-based pricing for energy, that's not an unsolvable problem. It's would cost a lot of money, but there are ways to get to a much more lower carbon energy grid, and that's just one of the myriad of things that are feasible.
Okay.
I'm rambling too much. I'm sorry.
No, this is very. I find it fascinating. I think it's really interesting to kind of look at these options through the lenses that you've suggested.
Yeah, General Electric will sell you a gas turbine that can run on hydrogen. Hydrogen is a zero carbon production. So there's some really interesting innovations this is a great time to be doing, to be focusing.
And of course, we know, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New York are all seriously pursuing offshore wind at this point, among other things. So let me just throw this out to everyone. A lot of what you just talked about seems like the private sector is a critical aspect of making much of that happen in one way or another, whether it's investing or building or operating. I know, again, my world, mainly transportation, the US is, I guess I would say, significantly behind most of the developed world when it comes to public-private partnerships and private ownership or operation of key mobility facilities and so forth. What's it going to take, if you will, for the private sector to really get interested and be a big part of this? How can we, what can the government do to bring the private sector in a way that does have public benefits?
Peter, I think one of the things we're seeing already in terms of transit and light rail is this investment in terms of the last mile, in terms of housing. So we're seeing in the area where I live, for example, in Mansfield and Attleboro, which have some of the fastest commuter rail routes into Boston. So everybody wants to jump on those trains. We're seeing apartment buildings, many of them spring up that are literally right next to the train stations. So again, it solves that last mile issue for people. It's good for the environment in terms of people walking, to those stations in the morning as opposed to driving and parking. We're seeing the same thing in Pawtucket and Central Falls in Rhode Island. in terms of, again, increased housing that I think has been needed for a long time, springing up close to those transit areas. So I think that's something where we see private investment that's really improving the entire transportation infrastructure and making it easier for people to get to work more quickly and avoid congestion, which we all want to do.
I think one of the big things, at least in speaking with developers, and not just real estate developers, the developers of all kinds of projects, is to accelerate the process. That I'm, and don't make fun of me, but I'm on Martha's Vineyard right now, and we had a wind project that was proposed 12 years ago, and took 8 years before they ultimately the developers ran out of money. There's a new project that has been approved. Bomer's approved it. That it was 9 years in the making. The other parts of the world don't have perhaps as thorough a review process, but they certainly don't have as long a review process. And that's one of the things that most folks in almost all aspects of infrastructure say that it's difficult. I'd like to build there's plenty of capital. Infrastructure funds there's dry powder in almost every sector in infrastructure of folks willing to invest and keenly interested in invest and doing a lot of innovation. There was a company in Houston that had a list of 12 bottlenecks of the national transmission grid, and they went around to move. Instead of making 160-mile high voltage transmission line, there was a 6-mile segment that they could build that would improve and increase. And they identified these 12 projects. None of them, they were not able to build any of them because of the not in my backyard scenario, which
Sure.
is totally understandable, but the process is just extremely burdensome for most developers.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, John, Mary. We're going to move on to our third broad question or topic here. And Christian, you're in the batter's box for this. And basically, kind of looking at the current federal infrastructure funding situation. What's the prognosis? We have this deal now, which I've noted in my LinkedIn post that it's a great step forward, but don't hold your breath. What's your take on where things seem to be and where they're going on infrastructure financing?
So everyone I talk to on the Hill is just as uncertain as I am. As a lot of people who are trying to figure this out. And I'm a big fan of horse racing, one of the few people left in America. And so I think handicapping this is just as complicated as handicapping a $15,000 claiming race at Laurel Park. So there's a lot of there. And so if I'm going to try and be as cogent as possible, but underlying all of this debate is that, as we had talked about before, is that we have to reauthorize the Highway Trust Fund. It runs out of money in September, and this is must-pass legislation. And so the Senate and the House are both on the verge of passing a surface transportation bill that would reauthorize the Highway Trust Fund. And traditionally, reauthorization of that trust fund served as an infrastructure bill of sorts, right? I mean, that's what it kind of served as, in addition to re-examining federal transportation writ large, policies writ large. And by way of background, I've worked on actually 2 of those bills. I worked on FAST Act and MAP 21. And they're fairly straightforward processes. I mean, you reauthorize the trust fund and Finance Committee comes up with change underneath the couch, try and make up for the difference between spending and what's in the trust fund. And then all the other committees of jurisdiction, my committee was the Commerce Committee, would produce a legislative title that would dealt with surface transportation issues. That's happening now, but the problem, not the problem, the complication is that there's all of this other infrastructure discussion taking place on top of the sort of must-pass surface transportation bill. As everyone noted, the president and Senate Republicans and Democrats have come up with a bipartisan $1.2 trillion compromise. How does that fit in to what the House and Senate are already doing on its surface transportation bill. I think the House, is really unsettled. It's not clear what they want to do in terms of folding that compromise into what the House is considering. I think that the Senate will likely use what EPW and what Commerce has already reported out as base text, and then try and fold that bipartisan compromise into the base text for Senate floor consideration. The added complication of that, though, is the very partisan Democratic so-called human infrastructure bill, that's what has been termed, that has no Republican support, but that the left wing of the Democratic Party really, really wants to push forward. And they would only be able to do that under budget reconciliation rules. So they would just be able to do that under a bare majority. The president had talked about earlier where he had said, well, I'm not going to accept this bipartisan deal unless you also send me the partisan deal as well, which upset many Republicans, I think rightfully so, saying that it was sort of bait and switch tactic that they use. And since then, the president has walked back his comments. On the other hand, Speaker Pelosi has made it her intention that she doesn't want to consider a bipartisan infrastructure package unless there's delivery of the partisan reconciliation package. So it's not clear exactly what's the pathway to get to the bipartisan package if the partisan package is a prerequisite for consideration in the House. At the end of the day, my long-winded way of saying what's going to happen ultimately on this is I believe that there is enough desire on the part of the speaker and the majority leader to deliver President Biden a victory. I think that that's ultimately what the goal is going to be. It's always hurting cats. I can speak particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, on the left wing of the party that really wants to go big and ambitious, and then the more moderate wing of the party that wants to be more moderate, to be more bipartisan. But at the end of the day, I think there's going to be made every attempt to not scuttle this deal, particularly with the midterms coming up and both majorities in the Senate and the House very much in jeopardy for the Democrats. I think there's going to be a desire and an effort to deliver President Biden a legislative victory, but how we get there is unclear. And the alternative is that everything could blow up. There'd be nothing, and all we get is a very skinny surface transportation bill like we've had in years past. So that's my long way of saying I don't know. And I don't. And everyone I talk to doesn't seem to know either.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me maybe toss you a sort of follow-on question that either will add to the uncertainty or maybe help a little bit. So it's my understanding that in a form, at least, we now have the return of earmarking, of earmarked projects of some sort.
Yeah.
Is how, if at all, does that play into this? In other words, is there the ability for, cross-party horse trading on pet projects and so forth to help make things, to grease the skids on getting things done?
That's actually a great question. Unfortunately, I don't know. That's another. Traditionally, as you've noted, earmarks were very useful in sort of buying votes. I mean, a member would be able to vote for a transportation bill because, such and such statue was being built in his or her district. It's not clear. There's also folks that are still, I think, ideologically opposed to earmarks as being just not good government. And it's not. I mean, the magnitude of the money involved, I think, is so high, and quite frankly, the partisanship in Washington is so high. I'm not sure whether the power of earmarks has the same sort of greasing ability that it has in the past. But it's something that I hadn't really thought of that, and it's something to keep an eye on.
Okay. John and Mary, from where you sit, what are your thoughts on this? The near-term funding, the bill and everything else? Anything you want to add on this?
It's obviously, I certainly agree with everything Christian said. Happy to see funding for roads, bridges, rail, and airports, which hopefully will come to fruition. Also, gratifying to see funding for electronic vehicle infrastructure, as well as low carbon or no carbon buses, ferries, et cetera. So, again, I think we're all, sitting back and waiting to see how this unfolds. And there's so many different scenarios. But, one plug I will make before, because we're getting close to the end of the hour, is that, I think that one of our challenges is to make these kinds of infrastructure issues meaningful to average folks, the people in my neighborhood. And, certainly at AAA, safety, public safety is our calling card. We lose 35,000 to 40,000 people on the roadways every year in crashes. Many scores more, millions more are injured. And so I think that, that's something that we can talk about that makes these issues meaningful to people, infrastructure that makes their lives easier, more convenient, and safer. And infrastructure improvements are a huge part of that, whether it's roads, bridges, transit, pedestrian, cyclists. So, I think that's something that always it's important to keep in mind, when we're talking about infrastructure, that these are issues that impact people's lives and impact the business community very directly. And, and that everybody really needs to have a voice in.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. John?
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And Christian's clearly the expert on this. I guess it's interesting that, and maybe I'll pose this as a question for him. Infrastructure is often viewed as a long-term solution to a short-term problem, and it's with the weather event in Texas last fall or last winter, the current weather event in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere. I think that's going to drive a lot of people to, I don't want to say back to a drawing board, but to take to look at solutions through a slightly different lens than we would have seen 6 or 8 months ago, just because it's fresh on people's minds. When the statistic was something like less than a third of the people have air conditioning in Washington State, and it's 114 in Portland. I mean, that's going to be a really interesting. These changes are really going to be interesting, and I'm just curious, Christian, is that going to shape the narrative?
I mean,
Christian, just before you answer, I'm sorry, very quickly, I just want to remind folks, our audience, that if you have any questions that you'd like to pitch to the panel or any individual panel member, you can do that through the Q&A item at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. So, sorry, Christian, please go ahead.
Not at all. I mean, one would hope, right, that these very sort of huge events would sort of open people's minds on this subject and sort of create and instill a sense of urgency that we have to deal with these issues, right? 116 degrees in Portland is just bananas. It's frightening. I mean, I think it's viscerally frightening to a lot of people. Am I optimistic that we're going to get serious about climate change in Congress? Quite frankly, no. One would hope that what happened on the Texas grid is a wake-up call, we have crumbling infrastructure that we need to invest in. But until we figure out a way to pay for it, and when certain revenue streams are off the table, it seems difficult in my mind that we're actually going to come up with serious solutions to this, because it's just politically the ideological divide is just so immense. When President Trump first was elected, I was working on the Commerce Committee at the time, and quite frankly, there was optimism on the side of Democrats that we'd be able to work with the administration on an infrastructure bill. That was something that President Trump ran on in the campaign, where he wanted to invest trillions of dollars in infrastructure. And quite frankly, a lot of Democrats were like, okay, let's do it. I mean, this is something we had been talking about for years, but ultimately it went nowhere, and it was all about, how do you pay for it? That was where the rub was. So until we solve that, I don't know how we get over that. We've got to have members who are ideologically opposed to certain types of policies are going to have to be willing to give on some of this stuff, I think, in order to get there. Not a great answer, but unfortunately, I think that's kind of where we're at.
Well, it's interesting in my experience working on infrastructure finance or transportation finance and funding initiatives around the country over my career. One pattern, it's a sort of a commander obvious thing, but often the most successful special tax or special fee types of initiatives that require voters to approve them in localities or counties or states, a very as specific as possible a list of projects or activities that money will pay for is put out, and it's critical to people feeling like they want to vote yes, support that initiative. So I think to your point, Mary, and somewhat to what you said, Christian, there needs to be a way to much more effectively convey to the public, to members of Congress, this X billions or whatever is going to go for projects or initiatives X, Y, Z, but also in a way that doesn't tie hands so much. I don't know what the answer is to address that, but that seems to me to be a key part of the solution. So we do have a question. So the question is, does the panel not believe Democrats can pass changes to the tax code through reconciliation that will help offset the cost of the infrastructure changes being sought? I guess that sounds, Christian, like a.
I think they can, yeah, and I think that's part of the plan. Just the issues that Democrats are going to have is you have on the one side, you have folks, members like Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, who are not going to want as ambitious of a plan as, say, members on the left like Senator Sanders or the Progressive Caucus in the House. So I think yes, the answer is yes to that, but the magnitude of those revenue changes, I think, is still very much up in the air, and it's going to have to. It's going to be the left wing and the more moderate wing of the Democratic Party that's going to be a little bit at tension with each other.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience at this point? We have just a few minutes left here. Okay, so I don't know, let me just take advantage of my position as moderator and just go around the room once more. Mary, John, Christian, any parting thoughts here as we go towards adjournment? Anyone?
Well, I'll start off just by, 4 words: accessibility, accountability, inclusion, and equity. I mean, I think all of these conversations that we're having have to be informed by, again, a drive toward equity, considering how all segments of a community or a population are going to be impacted by the policies that are enacted. So I think that has to be an important part of the discussion. And I think all funding options basically have to be on the table.
Great, thank you. John?
I guess I want to put a level of optimism. I think this is a really exciting time, and maybe it's because it has come to a head that 15 or 5 years ago you had a hard time understanding what then candidate Trump was talking about with infrastructure, and now everybody at least can spell the word and has a little more of an interest. So I think it's going to be exciting, and I think it's going to be transformative. I think just as with regard to transportation, just as the Interstate Highway Act bill did, I think that there will be some changes. It may be rubber tire cars on roads, but they're not going to be running on gasoline, or they're going to be running. They're going to be full of different people. I mean, so it is an exciting and really interesting time.
I guess I'll just close by saying that I hope I didn't sound too cynical, because I actually agree a lot with what John's saying. I think that not only is the private sector and the states doing a lot of exciting things, and I think they're really sort of leading the way, but I also do think that this is a unique time in Congress where if something's going to get done, now's the time, because I think there is enough political will to do something. The issue is whether or not we can navigate the very tricky path to actually get there.
Great. All right, well, again, I'd like to thank our panelists. This was, I found it very, very interesting, very enlightening to get these insights and expertise, and to think with everyone about, where we need to go in terms of infrastructure investment and how we might get there. So with that, Emily, Peter, I'm not sure who I'm turning it back to, but I believe that is, we're going to close out at this point. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, everyone.